So we're up to chapter 1, Mishnah 7. It's a really short one, but I think a very powerful and important lesson, especially due to some of the revelations that we've encountered in our greater society the past couple of months. Again, we are going through the lineage of Torah leadership, beginning with Moshe, men of the Great Assembly, Shimon HaTzadik, the last of the men of the Great Assembly, Antigonus, and then we started talking about the Zugos, the time in history, several hundred years, where the Jewish people were led by two co-leaders, one the Nasi, one the Af Beis Din. So we're right now in the second group of Zugos. The first one was Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan. Those were the first group of leaders. And then we have Yeshua ben Prachia, who we learned a lot about last week, and Nitai HaArbeli. So Nitai HaArbeli, what does he say? Nitai from Arbel. Omer, he says, so we'll read the Mishnah and then we'll try to see what we can learn from it. Harchet mishachein ra. Distance yourself from a bad neighbor. Va'al tischaber l'rasha. And do not associate or do not befriend a rasha, a wicked person. Va'al tisyaesh min ha'puranius. And do not despair of the retribution. So again, we've seen this theme or this structure throughout the whole book so far, that the leader, he had an axiom that he would say almost always is comprised of three parts, 1, 2, and 3. Number 1, distance yourself from a bad neighbor. Number 2, do not befriend a wicked person. Number 3, do not despair from the retribution. All the commentaries try to understand what's the common theme being strung between the three. And here it seems like very clearly that, if we had the previous Mishnah that talked about how to have good influences, how to have a good mentor, how to have a good friend. You have to judge favorably. Good friend is so critical, so important. You have to even pay money for a good friend. And you have to anoint for someone for yourself to be your teacher. Even maybe they're not worthy of it. So that's one side, to build up the positive influences in our lives, both in the form of mentors and the form of friends. That was last Mishnah. Here, it's the flip side. It's about avoiding negative influences, avoiding the kind of people and the kind of society that will drag us down following their behavior. And there's an interesting statement in the Talmud that answers the question, which one's more important? Is it more important to have good influences, or is it more important to not have bad influences? Are good influences, are they more beneficial than bad influences are harmful or not? It means if someone could choose one, to have good or to not have bad, which one would they choose? You want to have good influences, you want to not have bad influences. But which one of them is more potent? I think you can hear arguments from both sides. There's this famous axiom that I don't know where it comes from, but a little bit of light banishes a lot of the darkness, which seems to imply that a little bit of good influence is able to get rid of a lot of bad. That's a statement of apocryphal origins. But there's a statement of the Talmud I think is very powerful. It says, Tzadik me'atzmo v'rasha mechaviro. Which means a tzaddik is from himself, and a righteous person is from himself, and a rasha is from his friend. Which, there's various interpretations of what this means, but it could potentially mean is that if someone becomes a tzaddik, if someone becomes righteous, they had to invest a lot of their own effort to get there. They can't rely on the society to bring them towards the promised land, so to speak. Whereas a rasha, if someone becomes wicked, it's mechaviro, it's from his friends. Because all you need to have is bad friends, and you're probably, likely going to follow their ways. Which seems to imply that a harmful influence is more potent, more powerful in a negative sense than a good influence is in a positive sense. 2 examples that I heard from great friends of mine are bad reviews in a restaurant. If there's one bad review in a restaurant, they may have 5 or 10 good ones, but the bad one seems to hold more weight. And similarly with relationships, if you have some bad interaction with a couple, with spouses, that's probably going to outweigh a lot of very positive relationships. There's an amazing letter that I saw from the Chazon Ish, where he writes he gives a scale to this. Suppose you have someone who's trying to influence a group positively. And he's giving them musar, and he's giving them inspiration, and he's trying to inspire them towards becoming better people. And then you have one guy in the back who starts making funny faces. He's doing smirks, or he's like making quick jabs at the speaker. So the statement goes, Leitzanas achas, one derision, dochem mea tochachos. That casts away 100 reprimands. A reprimand maybe would help someone towards going the right path, but one derisive statement belittling the whole situation, that negates 100. It means one negative influence from one person is able to outweigh 100 positive influences for that same person. So that's the broad idea. The broad idea is that we don't necessarily think about this, because in order to prevent bad influences, you have to start before you have those bad influences. And you have to make your decisions based upon who you're going to associate as a result of those decisions, which is something we're not trained to do. And this is what the Mishnah is telling us. Before you have friends, before you have neighbors, choose who they are. So, for example, the Talmud tells us, when someone selects a home, where are you going to live? So you want to look at the school, and you want to look at the lot size and the layout, a lot of things. It says the Talmud, before you look at if it's a dir or not, if it's a nice home, check the neighbors. Because, again, the Talmud's perspective is what is going to be most likely to contribute towards you having a positive spiritual result of any interaction. And therefore, what's more impactful than anything is who the neighbors are. And we don't even think about that. We think maybe the neighborhood or the schools or the school district. But most important is what the taxes are. Talmud says before anything, who are the neighbors? Because that's going to influence you much more than anything else. Now, the Mishnah uses different terms. There's the bad neighbor and there's the wicked person. So I see all the commentaries are saying, they're trying to figure out what exactly does it mean by these subtleties. Don't be close. Distance yourself. Make yourself far from a bad neighbor. And don't befriend an evil person. So first of all, what's the difference between a bad neighbor and an evil person? That's not necessarily immediately evident, number one. And number two, why are we told in one instance from the bad neighbor, distance yourself? And in the other instance, with the wicked person, don't become friends with them. So it seems like to me, if you have a neighbor, there's, you're close, but you're not necessarily that close. You could go, 10 years without talking to your neighbor. You could wave at them or whatever, but you're not really necessarily friends. Whereas if you're a friend with someone, that's even closer. So it seems like when you're told to distance yourself from a neighbor, that seems like you're way more distant. Don't even be their neighbors. Make sure there's plenty of space between you and them. Don't even be their neighbor. Whereas the wicked person, it doesn't say don't be their neighbor, just don't be their friend. If they're in the neighborhood, okay, you could be maybe their neighbor, just don't be their friend. So it seems like that the distance we have to place between us and the bad neighbor is greater than the distance we have to place between us and the evil one, the wicked one. What does this mean? What do these terms mean? What does it mean, a bad neighbor, and what does it mean, a wicked one? So the Talmud tells us that there's two kinds of wicked people. There's wicked people, and there's really wicked people. And what's the difference? So the Talmud says that when you have something which is ra, bad, evil, that's someone that's evil to God and evil to man. I mean, some people, their relationship with God maybe leaves something to be desired, but they're very friendly with their neighbors. They're good people with regards to how they interact with other people. Interpersonally, they're fine. It's just that the relationship between them and God needs some mending. That's one kind of evil. But that's not as bad as someone who is evil both to God and to people. So Rashi gives an example. If someone's a thief or a murderer, that's someone, to steal or to murder is against the Torah. It's against God, but it's also against your neighbors. It's against the interests of other people as well. That's much worse than someone who is evil, who's wicked with respect to the relationship with God, but they're okay with their neighbors. So the example, like Rashi, is someone who desecrates the holidays or someone who eats not kosher, that's someone that's rebelling against God, but not against other people, because you don't hurt other people by eating non-kosher. And therefore, perhaps we could suggest that the more evil someone is, the more of a bad influence that they are, the more distance you should place between you and them. So when someone is bad to God and bad to people, don't even be neighbors with them. Don't even live in the same neighborhood. You have to if they live here, you got to move to other zip code. Whereas if someone needs work, but is not totally evil, you could be their neighbor, that's fine. And you can have a cordial relationship with them. You don't have to turn away and run to the other side whenever you see them, but don't become good friends with them because they'll influence you. I think that's a way to understand what the Mishnah is telling us, is that to the degree of negative influence that they could potentially have on you, that's how much distance you should place between you and them, which seems like it's good advice. This seems like it makes a lot of sense. So I want to dig in a little bit into some of these lessons of the perils of bad neighbors and bad friends. So first of all, the first episode where someone chose bad neighbors was the instance of Lot. Lot and Abraham, they had to go separate ways. And Lot, he was captivated by all the wealth and all the power and all the prestige of Sodom and Gomorrah, and therefore he ignored the fact that there'll be a bad influence on him. And therefore he chose to embrace the bad neighbors because of all the material benefits that he would garner as a result. And we know how that ended up for him. There's another episode. There's many times where this idea is hinted in the Torah, but also very powerfully in the book of Numbers, in the story of Korach. Korach mounts a rebellion against Moshe. And when the Torah outlines who are his co-conspirators, Rashi does an amazing job of telling us, of contrasting or utilizing information from the rest of the Torah to find out that these people were actually neighbors. Because the Torah in the beginning of the book of Numbers tells us where every tribe was camped. And if you look at where all the tribes were camped and all the people that were part of the conspiracy against Moshe, they were all neighbors. And Rashi tells us, why does it mention all these people and where they're from? Because the Shevet of Ruvain, the tribe of Ruvain, was right next to the part of Levi that was Kahas, that was where Korach is from. And therefore, Oila Rasha Oila Shchena, which means woe unto the wicked one and woe unto his neighbor. Which seems to imply that had Korach's co-conspirators, had they lived elsewhere, they probably would not have been influenced by the drive towards rebellion and mutiny of Korach, and they would have been spared. And we know how that ended up as well. So that's the simple idea. The first idea is that you're going to be influenced by your neighbors, and if they're really, really bad people, don't be their neighbors. That's number one. Don't befriend a wicked person. So I saw a very frightening teaching by Rabbeinu Yonah. I'm trying to understand what it means. We'll try to grapple with what he says here. Don't befriend a wicked person. And he says like this. He says, well, if someone does one sin, regardless of whether the sin's against God or against man, someone sins. That's limited. That's one sin. And yes, it's terrible. You can repent, hopefully, and fix it. But when someone is befriending and supporting a wicked person, they actually become connected spiritually to that person. And therefore, everything that person does affects them. So you have one sin in isolation. Okay, it's terrible, but you could address it and you're done with. Whereas, if you connect yourself to a wicked person, you become spiritually bound to each other, and thus all his actions, they can be reattributed back to you. So this one sin of befriending a wicked person, that could lead to millions of sins, as opposed to just one very evil act on its own. It's only one sin, and you're done with it. What if you want to befriend them in order to influence them? Do you have to befriend them to influence them? Is it appropriate for someone to compromise on their own stature in order to help others? That's a hard question. The first rule is do no harm, right? So if you're going to harm yourself, maybe you'll help someone else, but is that really worth the trouble? We're told that our nation has the responsibility of the mandate of Tikkun Olam, fixing the world, bringing the world to perfection. Now, if you look at all the instructions of the Torah, never does it say, go out to the idolaters and try to bring them back to monotheism. It doesn't say that anywhere in the Torah. Yet, we're tasked with this responsibility of changing the whole world. We're told we're going to be small in number, and we're told to be insular. You look at there's many mitzvahs in the Torah that say, don't associate with idolaters. Have your own communities. Be insular. So it seems like to be in opposition. Well, let's look at history. If we could say, where is the world today versus where it was 2,000 years ago, and trace me reasons why it changed. So I think it's undeniable that what we would call the ideals of Abraham are widely accepted today. Whereas 2,000 years ago, they were a foreign concept limited to a very insular community. Now, at what point in these 2,000 years were the Jews not insular? It's relatively recently, maybe a couple hundred years, when the die was already cast that the ideals of Abraham are being permeated throughout the world. So, again, the argument is that Abraham and Abraham's descendants are told you will be the beacon for the world. It doesn't say you should try to think about how you'll be most effective at being the beacon of the world. It says follow the instructions and then you'll be the beacon. And you know what happened for the large part of history is that we did follow the instructions, and we look back now in history, it's hard for us to see how all the dots connected, certainly during the time. But we know that the Jewish or the Judeo-Christian ideals, if you will, they have become the accepted norm in the vast majority of the world. Now, even Abraham himself, he had two modes of influencing people. There was mode number one, where he had his tent, and he welcomed people into his tent. Again, he wasn't going out to them and being subject to their influence. He brought them to him, and they were subject to his. That's number one. Number two, he would go and have very public debates, but very impersonal ones, where he wasn't engaging with people. It wasn't befriending the wicked people. He was debating them, and he was trouncing them with his logic. And that was done in a very public setting, not an intimate one. And that, again, does not conflict with this Mishnah, because he wasn't befriending them. So we see two ways of influencing others without necessarily being influenced. And we see a whole history of a nation and ideals that were so foreign from the accepted conventional wisdom 2,000 years ago, yet have become so pervasive in our world, despite the fact that we never went on any sort of organized, concerted mission to try to disseminate that. Now, we say that part of the reason why the Jewish people are always wandering from place to place is to spread our influences. But remember, we don't choose to go into exile. God is the one who puts the chess pieces and maneuvers history to make sure that our influence will spread to every corner of the world. But nowhere in the Torah does it say, you, using your tiny brain, comparatively, should try to think about how you can influence the world. It says, you will influence the world if you do X, Y, and Z, and A, B, C, D, a lot of other things. Right? That's what it says. And for the large part of history, we've followed those instructions, and we've attained those results. And how the instructions yield those outcomes, that's not our responsibility, that's God's. So let's get back to not befriending evil people. So I think that, maybe today, in all the revelations that are going on with prominent leaders in politics and in culture and entertainment, it's been a trend the past couple of months of people being exposed for really bankrupt moral character. And I think that, even the fact that we are exposed to all this news, I think it really has a negative effect. I'll give you an example. The verse in the end of Genesis, it talks about after Jacob dies, Jacob passes away, and he asks Joseph to bury him in Israel. And he made some promise, made some swear. And afterwards, Jacob assembles all his sons and he gives them all blessings. And then he passes away. And they mourn him, and the Egyptians also mourn him. He was a hero, a great hero in broader society as well. And finally, Joseph goes to Pharaoh and makes a formal request to Pharaoh that he be allowed to take Jacob back to the cave of the patriarchs, back to Israel for burial. And Pharaoh agrees, and the verse indicates why. Ka'asher hishbiacha. He tells Joseph, go back to Israel and bury your father like he made you swear. So Rashi points out is that the only reason why Pharaoh allowed Joseph to bury his father in Israel was because he had made him swear that. Which seems to indicate that had Joseph not sworn to bury Jacob in Israel, Pharaoh would not have allowed this to happen. He would have forced him to bury him in Egypt. Now Rashi says why? Well, why does Pharaoh only allow if he makes him swear? So Rashi tells us that there was also another agreement, another oath that Joseph had made many years prior to Pharaoh. Because the rule was in Egypt that the Pharaoh had to be versed in all languages. And when Joseph was being nominated to be the viceroy of Egypt, he demonstrated his proficiency in all the languages of the world. And they were going through language after language, and finally they got to Hebrew. And Joseph, of course, could speak Hebrew, but Pharaoh could not, which technically by Egyptian law would invalidate Pharaoh as a legitimate king. And Joseph swore to Pharaoh that he won't reveal the fact that he is lacking in one of the languages of the world. He doesn't speak Hebrew. And therefore, says Rashi, that Pharaoh says, if I make you renege on your oath to your father, there may come a time that you'll renege on your oath to me. So some of the commentaries ask, wait a minute, is Joseph going to go and start bad-mouthing his superior? He's going to start revealing because, oh, you made me break one oath, I'm going to break the other oath. No. The answer is that once Joseph gets accustomed, once he gets exposed to certain behavior, once an oath is not sacrosanct, it's very likely that that's going to erode the seriousness and severity that he previously placed in his oath, and will eventually come a time where he'll reveal the oath that he made to Pharaoh, not to reveal the fact that Pharaoh was not conversed in Hebrew. Which I think extends this idea more. When you're exposed to certain behavior, that filters in. And that actually affects you on a very intimate level that you're not even aware. Joseph, if he was just exposed to the idea of breaking oaths, that would already influence him to break further oaths, perhaps down the line. I had a Rebbe, a teacher, Rosh Hashiva in Israel, that whenever he heard the church bells ringing, he would right away cover his ears. He says he doesn't want to be exposed to it. He feels like even just hearing this noise, he doesn't want to have any part of it. That's what he would always cover his ears, because he doesn't want to be exposed to any sort of influence at all, even if it's the most, what's bells, right? It could be, might as well be the bell that you ring by the doorbell, right? It might as well be that. It's the same noise. But no, it comes from this place. He doesn't want to listen to it. He would cover his ears, which shows this idea that we try to distance ourselves as much as possible from any bad influence, be it a bad neighbor, a bad friend, or even bad behavior or bad associations. Those all penetrate. And finally, the Mishnah ends, do not despair from the retribution. So Rashi gives us two different interpretations of what this means. So according to one interpretation, it means don't despair that retribution will not come. You say, well, why should I be worried about all these bad influences? Everything's going for us. Everything's going for him, the bad influence. Why should I lock myself out of their world, their sphere? Which is a way of saying that people are not assured that the retribution will come. And therefore, why should I distance myself from the bad influence when it's only good for them, and it seems like there's lots of good forecast in the future for them. And therefore, the verse tells us, don't despair, which means don't give up on the fact that retribution will come. And when it comes for your evil neighbor or your evil friend, it's going to influence you as well. You'll be swept up with it too. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation that Rashi brings is that don't despair from retribution when retribution actually comes. It means when the tide turns on an individual, on a community, on a society, on a nation, there is a tendency towards getting sad and depressed and trying to grasp for answers. And here we're being encouraged. It's kind of like ending the Mishnah on a positive note. Don't give up. Don't be despaired when retribution actually happens to us. And if you'll notice, if you read through Scripture and you find that there's two ways that the prophets taught to us. They taught to us in a very foreboding, ominous way about be wary about what you're doing because the retribution is coming. But what about when retribution already comes? When we are already in the throes of agony, of pain, of punishment, of dispersion, of expulsion. What then? Then the message is very positive. And the message is very inspirational. Don't despair because of bad things that happen to you. Always try to find positivity. Try to find the silver lining. Try to find the meaning in your suffering, which is a very nice theme to leave off with the Mishnah. I just want to circle back to the first interpretation here. So, for example, Rabbeinu Yonah, one of the commentaries, he says that someone who wants to have a bad neighbor or a bad friend, and they think they're able to shield themselves from all the negative influences. So, some say they might be able to try to time the market. I'll be good friends with him as long as it serves my influence, my benefit, my purposes, my goals. But when things turn sour, I'll jump off the boat and I'll be spared. Maybe that's something that Lot would have said when he went to Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm just going to be here for a little bit. Once I make it big, I'll move out. Or I'll be here and I'll try to shield myself as much as I can from the bad influences. I'm sure he did that. Lot, after all, was influenced by Abraham as well. But we see what actually happened. When the retribution came, it came very swiftly, and Lot wasn't really able to save himself or to save his whole world with him. He lost his wife, he lost some of his children, he lost all of his material possessions. And that's all a result of not avoiding bad influences. Now, there's an amazing Talmud that I want to read to you here, which, again, highlights this point that we don't necessarily see punishment for wicked people, right? That's not our job. Our job is to avoid the bad influences and to be aware that the retribution will come, and don't despair if it doesn't come. So the Talmud tells us something very powerful. It says that Moshe, when he went up to heaven, and he's looking over God's shoulder, so to speak, where God's writing the Torah, and God writes that the Almighty is erech apayim, slow to anger. Means when the Almighty gets angry, he doesn't exact retribution right away. So Moshe tells God, well, you missed a word. You should have written erech apayim latzadikim. God is slow to anger for the tzadikim. And God says, no. Erech apayim, I'm slow to anger for everyone. Even for Rishayim, even for wicked people. That's the way God, that's the way God treats us. And God tells him, you should be aware that there's going to come a time in the future, in your history, in your story, where you're going to very much want me to be slow to anger for wicked people as well. Fine, that's where the narrative ends. And it fast forward to the story of the golden calf. Moshe goes down from heaven, and he sees the people engaging in this idolatry, or seems like idolatry, very bad behavior, and God says, I'm destroying them. And Moshe says, wait a minute, slow to anger, remember that? And God tells him, but wait a minute, didn't you tell me that's only for tzaddikim? Moshe, you yourself said that should be only for tzaddikim. I'm going to listen to you. And Moshe responds to God, but didn't you say it's also for Rishayim? It's also for the wicked ones? And that's why the verse concludes, Yigdal Narkoach Hashem Kasher Dibarta, where Moshe tells him, I want you to expand the character of God, the characteristic of the treatment of God, Kasher Dibarta, as you spoke, as you mentioned earlier. Which means as you pledged to give a lot of runway for the wicked before you exact punishment. This is the way God treats us in our world. We, certainly our nation, we've gone through some tough times. And we've had interactions with nations and individuals that have been decidedly negative. And here we're told to avoid them, right? Resist them. Don't befriend them. They're bad. Don't fall into their lot. But if you're living under the Roman Empire, Pax Romana, and the Romans are very brutal in their cruelty, in their treatment of Jewish communities, and their very painful and restrictive laws that they pass and decrees they pass against the Jewish people, and you're sitting in the middle of 400 years of Roman domination, the fact that Rome will fall and will be an afterthought once they're gone, that's not very helpful to you right now. What does it do for me right now? Yeah. And says the Mishnah, don't despair. Don't despair. Yes, there's a lot of time between sin, so to speak, of the evil and when they get punished. And I would say, dare I say, if you were stuck in the Kovna ghetto in 1944, the fact that Nazi Germany is going to be destroyed within 18 months, it doesn't help you necessarily. You have a tendency to get despaired. And any time throughout history, the evil has a relatively long shelf life. And we're told to dissociate from them, even if it means giving up, so to speak, being part of society to a certain degree. Would you advise someone to go, knowing what you know today, would you advise someone to pursue a career in Hollywood? That's a hard question to answer. But clearly our Mishnah will say, don't befriend those people. Because you know what? It's a culture. It's a cultural problem. And if you're going to immerse yourself in that culture, you're going to be influenced invariably. But wait a minute, they control the levers of power and culture of our world. They're the ones who are in charge. They're the ones who are able to shape the narrative. I want to be part of that. And they seem to be all powerful. Mishnah says, don't despair for the retribution. Yes, they may have, if there is a convention of evil in the world, they may be very powerful and may seem to be indestructible for the time being. Don't despair. Retribution will indeed come for them, and therefore it's better for you to avoid such interactions. So to conclude, with this week's Parsha, in Vayishlach, Jacob sends a message to Esau. And right at the beginning of the Parsha, Im Lavan Garti, I lived with Lavan, with Laban, and now I'm coming to visit you. And we know they have this sort of climactic reunion, Jacob and his brother, who had pledged to kill him 30 years prior. Now, Rashi points out that Im Lavan Garti, I lived with Laban, but the word Garti, it's the same letters as Taryag. Taryag is the amount of 613, amount of mitzvos, which what Jacob is subliminally hinting to Esau is that even though I lived with Laban, I still observed Taryag. And that's, of course, for Jacob. And we saw that again with Rebekah, that even though she was submerged in a bad environment, she wasn't influenced by them. But that's the exception. Esau was under the impression that, wait a minute, Jacob's been living now for 20 years with Laban, one of the wiliest, most deceptive individuals known to the world. Maybe he was influenced. Therefore, maybe he's spiritually vulnerable. Comes along Jacob and responds, no, I kept all of Taryag, you won't be able to one-up me. Additionally, at the end of this week's Parsha, after Jacob he meets with Esau and he survives that. Vayavo Yaakov Shalem. Yaakov, he came complete. He was safe. Interestingly, I saw this weekend, I saw the Chassam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Schreiber, who was one of the great Jewish leaders of Hungary and Romania in the 18th and 19th centuries. He left an ethical will to his children. And I happened to have just read this yesterday, and it was interesting because it's really pertinent to what we're talking about. So the word Yaakov arrived shalem, complete. So he says shalem is an acronym. Shalem is shame, lashon, and malbush. That's the three letters of shin, lam, and mem. Shin is for shame, lamed is for lashon, and malbush is for clothing. What does that mean? So shalem can hint to shame is the name, and lashon is the language, and malbush is clothing. And in his ethical will to his children and his descendants, he writes to his children, don't adopt non-Jewish names, don't speak the language of the non-Jews, and don't dress in the style of the greater society. And that's, so to speak, like a certain cultural installation of having certain safety measures to ensure that you won't become influenced by your neighbor. But again, it's from the idea of Jacob, that Jacob, he is unique, that despite the fact that he had all these interactions with Laban and Esau, he emerged unscathed. So I think the bottom line here is that we're being advised in this Mishnah that the influences that we surround ourselves with are very, very impactful into what we turn out to be. And unless we think about it ahead of time and we choose who we want to be influenced by, it's going to be too late because we're already going to be influenced by them. And therefore we're told, distance ourselves from a bad neighbor. If someone is really, really bad, don't even live in the neighborhood. Number one. Number two, don't befriend evil people. People who could be a bad influence upon you, don't become good friends with them. You could have a cordial relationship with them, sure. We could be nice. We could try to be a good influence on others, to be a good example upon others. But the people who we befriend with, we spiritually bind ourselves towards, and that could be very dangerous. And lastly, we're told, don't despair from retribution, which could mean either don't be under the false impression that the evil will reign eternally, number one. Number two, it could also mean a very positive spin on a little bit of a depressing Mishnah, that there's always positivity, there's always a silver lining, even when bad things happen. Thus concludes Mishnah 7. I look forward to next time, Mishnah 8.